On April 10, 2025, Canada's highest court looked at one of the most infamous home invasion stories in modern Canadian true crime, and confirmed something that sounds impossible the first time you hear it. Not that the attack didn't happen. It did. Not that a woman named Jennifer Pan wasn't convicted by a jury. She was. But that the first-degree murder convictions tied to her mother's death had to be tried again. And the reason wasn't a new witness, or a dramatic DNA twist, or a surprise confession. It was about a story. The story the jury was allowed to consider, and the story they weren't. Because the night Jennifer Pan called 911, she sounded like the third victim. She said masked intruders were inside her home. She said her parents had been shot. She said she'd been tied up and left alive. And for a short time, that's what everyone thought. Until detectives started looking closer at one small detail after another. Details that, on their own, could have meant nothing. But together, they pointed back to the same terrifying question. What if the person who sounded most afraid was the one who opened the door? Today, I'm going to walk you through the Jennifer Pan case from the inside out. The family at the center of it, the pressure cooker life that set the stage, the investigation that unraveled her story thread by thread, the evidence that convinced a jury, and the legal twist, years later, that sent the case back toward a new trial on the murder charge. And as we go, I want to do something that often gets lost in the plot of this story. I want to keep Bich Pan and Hann Pan in the frame, not as props in someone else's downfall, but as real people, with a real family, whose lives were changed in one night. Because when the headlines say daughter hires hitman, the shock is instant. But the damage is something else entirely. Before we get into the timeline, a quick note about sources and tone. This script is built from court materials and widely reported coverage of the case, including the Supreme Court of Canada's plain language summary of its April 2025 ruling, and reporting that drew on investigative records and interviews with detectives. I'm going to be careful with what we can and can't know for sure about private moments inside the Pan household. When something is based on public reporting rather than directly on court summary language, I'll frame it that way, and I'll avoid graphic detail. The violence in this case is real, and it deserves seriousness, not spectacle. If you like deep-dive true crime told with compassion and clarity, where we follow the evidence, not the internet noise, subscribe now so you don't miss the next one. And tell me up front, what do you think breaks a family more, one catastrophic argument, or years of quiet pressure? Drop your answer in the comments while the opening question is still fresh. Now, let's rewind, because this story didn't begin with a gunshot. It began with a certain kind of immigrant dream. A certain kind of bargain that families don't always say out loud. You come to a new country, you work, you sacrifice, you build stability from scratch, and in return, you ask one thing of your children. Make it worth it. For the Pan family, that dream had a shape. It looked like a neat suburban home in Markham, Ontario, a Toronto area community that, to outsiders, reads as safe, ordinary, even quiet. It looked like a daughter with talent, someone who could sit at a piano and make adults stop talking mid-sentence. It looked like grades and degrees, and a future that felt certain enough to plan around. And it looked like rules. If you grew up in a house like that, you already know the texture of it. Rules aren't always yelled. Sometimes they're simply there. Dinner at a set time. A curfew that's not negotiable. Friends who need to be approved. Phones that get checked. A plan for your life that's already written in someone else's handwriting. Public reporting and later discussion of the case describes Jennifer Pan as a child who was pushed hard, academically and musically. She was known as a talented pianist in her early years. And her parents' expectations, again as reported, weren't casual suggestions. They were the standard. But expectations aren't automatically abuse. And strict parenting isn't automatically cruelty. Many families function with high standards and still have warmth and safety underneath it. So who were Bich and Hann Pan, really? From what's been publicly described, they were parents who wanted control because they believed control was protection. They wanted a daughter who was safe. They wanted a daughter who was successful. They wanted a daughter who was surrounded by the right people, heading toward the right career, making the right choices. Because when you've worked your entire life to build a secure world for your family, watching your child step toward risk can feel like watching a bridge you built start to crack. And the truth is, for parents like this, love and fear often wear the same face. When you're inside the family, it can feel suffocating. When you're outside the family, it can look like devotion. And somewhere between those two perspectives, a daughter learned how to perform. Not just perform piano pieces, perform a life. You can picture the scene because it's so ordinary. A kitchen table, papers spread out, report card held between fingers. A parent asking questions in a calm voice that still feels like pressure. A child nodding, saying yes, saying it's fine, saying I'm doing it. And then going to her room, closing the door, exhaling. In the Jennifer Pan case, that door becomes important, metaphorically and literally. Because later, investigators would become fixated on what was opened, what was closed, and what was allowed to enter. But long before the attack, there was another story running in parallel. The story Jennifer was telling her parents, and the story she was living when they weren't looking. According to widely reported accounts, Jennifer lied about her education, lying about school progress, forging documents, maintaining the image of a student on a path her parents wanted. Reports describe her fabricating details to keep that image intact, even as the reality underneath it was falling behind. Here's the thing about long-term deception. It doesn't feel like one big lie. It feels like 100 small ones that you keep telling, because the moment you stop, the whole structure collapses. It's easier to add one more story than to admit the first. And then there was the relationship. Public reporting describes Jennifer's boyfriend as Daniel Wong, sometimes called Danny, someone her parents did not approve of, and someone Jennifer continued seeing anyway, largely in secret. This matters because, in many true crime cases, relationships are a side plot. In this one, the relationship is a power line running through the whole house. Because if Jennifer's life at home was about rules, the relationship was about escape. And if she felt trapped at home, the relationship was also a kind of rebellion, one that, over time, became tangled up with her lies, her fear of being exposed, and her desperation to keep control. This isn't an excuse. It's context. Context is how you understand a fire without calling it fate. Now keep the parents in view. Imagine being Bich Pan. Imagine being Han Pan. You believe you're enforcing discipline for your child's future. You believe you're keeping her on track. You believe you know where she is each day, what she's doing, who she's with, because you're monitoring it. And you believe that if you push hard enough, she will eventually become the successful version of herself you picture. In that worldview, lying isn't just disobedience. It's betrayal. It means the entire relationship, you and your child, has been operating on false ground. And in many families, when the truth starts to leak out, the conflict isn't a single moment. It's a series of tightening circles. More restrictions, more arguments, more surveillance, more secrecy. You can feel how it escalates even without being there. And then, one night in November 2010, the conflict leaves the level of arguments and rules and moves into something much darker. The Supreme Court of Canada's plain language summary describes what happened in blunt terms. 3 armed intruders entered the Pan family home in November 2010. Both parents were shot. Bich Pan died. Han Pan survived with serious injury, and Jennifer Pan was left physically unharmed, tied to a banister. That's the public skeleton of the event. And then comes the voice, the 911 call. That call is part of why this case stuck to people's minds for years. Because a 911 call can do something evidence can't. It can make you feel like you're there. It can make you choose sides emotionally before the facts even arrive. A young woman sounds panicked. She's saying there are intruders. She's saying her parents have been shot. She's saying she's tied up. In that moment, the story is simple. A family was targeted and one daughter survived. But detectives don't get to live in the simplicity. They're trained to look for what doesn't fit. And in the earliest phase of this investigation, suspicion didn't come from one giant red flag. It came from the way the scene sat. From reporting about the case, we know investigators quickly noticed things that didn't match a straightforward home invasion narrative. Entry that didn't show obvious force in at least some camera coverage, a surviving witness left physically unharmed, and a sequence of events that raised questions about why this one person was spared. That doesn't mean every home invasion fits a script. Real crimes are messy. Criminals do irrational things. But detectives live in patterns, and this one fell off. Here's a key idea that will matter later. When someone is lying in a high-stakes situation, they often over-explain. They add details they think make them sound believable. They fill silence with narrative. They try to control the listener's picture of events. Jennifer Pan, in the immediate aftermath, gave her account. And according to public reporting and the documentary coverage that later revisited the case, detectives felt suspicious early. Not because they knew she did it, but because they couldn't stop asking, why leave her alive? If you're asking that question right now, I want you to hold it, but hold it carefully, because it's a dangerous question too. Sometimes victims are left alive because attackers flee, because they panic, because they believe someone is already dead, because the victim was hidden, because the plan changes. Survival doesn't equal guilt. But in this case, survival became a spotlight, and soon, detectives began to look at Jennifer's life beyond that night. This is where the case shifts from a crime scene to a biography, and it's where the quiet damage to the victims becomes clearer. Because the more investigators dug, the more the family story came into view. Strict household, difficult relationship, conflict over a boyfriend, and a young woman with a history of deception about what she was doing day to day. Again, context is not justification. But for investigators, context can create motive. And motive answers one of the oldest questions in homicide work. Why? Why would anyone want these parents dead? In the prosecution's theory, described in court summaries, Jennifer Pan arranged, with help from Daniel Wong and others, to have her parents killed. That's an extraordinary claim. It's one of the darkest allegations you can make about a person. So how does a case like that get built? Not with one piece of evidence, with layers. Start with communication. In many modern cases, the truth is not found in a confession first. It's found in phones, calls, texts, and patterns of contact. Public reporting and later documentary coverage describe investigators finding incriminating messages and call records that tied Jennifer to people connected to the attack. There are mentions in reporting of texts that suggested coordination and hiring, including references to finding someone who could carry it out. This is the point where a lot of true crime stories become technology saves the day. But it's not that clean. Technology gives you raw material. Humans still have to interpret it, argue over it, and prove it in court beyond a reasonable doubt. And while the case against Jennifer moved forward, the victims were dealing with what you can't screenshot. Bich Pan was gone, a mother who had built her life around family and expectations gone. And Hann Pan, who survived, had to wake up into a world where his wife was dead and his daughter was under suspicion. Think about that for a second. Even if he believed her at first, even if he didn't, either way his life was split in two. Before the attack, after the attack, and in after, everything familiar becomes contaminated. Your home doesn't feel like home. Your family doesn't feel safe. The child you raised becomes a question mark. One of the most haunting lines attributed to Hann Pan in later reporting is the idea that losing his wife meant losing his daughter, too, because even the relationship could not survive what happened. Whether you've lived through something like that or not, you can understand the shape of the grief. It's not just grief for the person who died. It's grief for the family you thought you had. Now, here's where the investigation makes a sharp turn. According to widely reported accounts, Hann Pan later provided information that deepened suspicion toward Jennifer, suggesting she did not behave like a terrified hostage in those moments. That kind of statement is powerful, but it's also complicated. Trauma, memory, injury, and time can all affect recall. Defense teams often challenge it. Still, in this case, it became part of the narrative investigators followed. By late November 2010, Jennifer Pan was arrested. And over the years that followed, the case expanded to include other names, people alleged to have helped plan and carry out the attack. Daniel Wong, Lenford Crawford, David Mulvaganam. Those names matter not just because of guilt or innocence, but because they show the structure the Crown described. Jennifer at the center, others as intermediaries and participants. Here's a comment question for you, because this is where people split. If you were on a jury, what would you need to see before you believed a case like this, where the central allegation is that the victim was actually the organizer? Is it a confession, phone data, a witness, a combination? Tell me what threshold you think is fair. Now we need to talk about the legal arc, because this case doesn't end with an arrest. It moves into years of court, and that's where the public perception often freezes. Convicted, sentenced, done. But the justice system has layers too. In Canada, a first-degree murder conviction is the most serious category, often tied to planning and deliberation or specific legal circumstances. Second-degree murder is still murder, but without the same first-degree classification. Manslaughter is different again, typically involving unlawful killing, without the same proven intent to kill. Those categories aren't technical trivia. They decide what the jury is allowed to consider, and they shape what justice looks like in the eyes of the law. At Jennifer Pan's trial, the Crown's theory was that she arranged, with help, to have both parents killed. A jury convicted Jennifer Pan and 3 others of first-degree murder for Bich Pan's death and attempted murder for Hann Pan. In 2015, the sentencing reflected the seriousness of those convictions. Life imprisonment, with parole eligibility rules consistent with first-degree murder in Canada. This is where the story could have ended, but it didn't, because appeals are where the story becomes literal. An appeal is not simply a second jury. It's a legal argument that something went wrong in the way the trial was conducted, something serious enough that the verdict can't stand as is. In this case, the key appeal issue, later summarized by the Supreme Court, was about what the trial judge told the jury. The trial judge, according to the Supreme Court's plain-language case summary, instructed the jury around 2 scenarios that could establish guilt on the evidence presented. Scenario 1, it was a planned and deliberate attack intended to kill both parents. Scenario 2, it was a home invasion and robbery during which the parents were shot. But the defense had urged a third scenario, that there was a plan to kill only Hann Pan, and that Bich Pan was shot in carrying out that plan. Why does that matter? Because if a jury accepts that third scenario, it can change what degree of murder applies to Bich Pan's death for some accused, potentially second-degree murder or even manslaughter, rather than first-degree murder. The trial judge refused to put that third scenario to the jury, saying it had no air of reality, meaning in plain terms, no reasonable jury could reach that conclusion based on the evidence. That decision, what options the jury was given, became the hinge. In May 2023, Ontario's Court of Appeal agreed with the defense on that point. The third scenario should have been left with the jury, and the failure to do so required a new trial on the first-degree murder charge. But the Court of Appeal did something else, too. It left the attempted murder convictions in place, concluding the jury instruction error didn't taint those convictions the same way. And then the case went higher. The Crown appealed to the Supreme Court of Canada, seeking to restore the first-degree murder convictions. The accused cross-appealed, seeking to set aside the attempted murder convictions too. This is the part of the story that people often misunderstand, so I want to slow down and make it clear. A new trial order on first-degree murder does not mean Jennifer Pan was declared innocent. It means the legal process requires a jury, next time, to be allowed to consider all verdicts supported by the evidence, especially lesser-included offenses, if they have an air of reality. On April 10, 2025, the Supreme Court of Canada dismissed both sides' appeals. It confirmed that the jury should have been instructed to consider the third scenario and that a new trial on the first-degree murder count was appropriate. But it also confirmed the attempted murder convictions stand. That's the legal state of play as described in the Supreme Court's own summary. If you're getting something out of this deep dive, especially the legal side that's easy to miss, hit like so more people who care about careful true crime can find it. Now here's the emotional trap the case sets, and it's why it remains so polarizing. If you believe the Crown's main theory, that both parents were meant to die, then the idea of a third scenario can sound like hair-splitting. Because to many people, it feels like they still planned a killing. Someone still died. Why does the category matter? But in law, category matters because it's tied to what was proven beyond a reasonable doubt about intent and planning as it relates to each victim. And in a case with multiple accused and a complex set of alleged roles, the jury needs the full map, not a narrowed path. So the Supreme Court ruling doesn't rewrite the horror of what happened. It rewrites what a jury must be allowed to decide. That's the big twist. But it's not the only one. Because when you pull back from the legal argument, you're still left with the human catastrophe. Bich Pan died. Hann Pan survived, but with life-altering consequences. Jennifer Pan, their daughter, became the center of a public story that turned her into a symbol. The perfect daughter facade, the alleged manipulation, the betrayal. And because the case involved police interviews and interrogation footage that later became widely seen, the public felt unusually close to it, as if watching someone's mask slip in real time. That sense of proximity can make people feel certain. But certainty is exactly what the law tries to earn, not assume. That's why jury instructions matter. They shape certainty. Now, you might be wondering, what happens next? A new trial on a first-degree murder count is not a small thing. It means prosecutors can try again to prove first-degree murder, and defense teams can argue for a different interpretation, potentially leading to different verdict outcomes for different accused. At the same time, because the attempted murder convictions were upheld, the case is not reset to zero. The legal reality is layered. And this is where I want to bring it back to the victims, because retrials tend to reopen wounds that never fully healed. For Hann Pan, any renewed court process isn't just a legal proceeding. It's a return to the worst chapter of his life. It's sitting again with the fact that someone came into his home and tried to end it. It's facing again the public retelling, the speculation, the headlines. And it's carrying again the complicated grief of a father whose family was shattered and whose relationship with his daughter became inseparable from the crime itself. For Bich Pan, a retrial can't change the outcome. It can only change how the system labels what happened to her and what it says about responsibility for her death. That distinction is cold comfort to loved ones, but it matters in a justice system built on definitions. Now let's talk about motive carefully, because it's where so many versions of this story get reckless. Some reporting has suggested inheritance and financial gain were part of the alleged motive. Other reporting emphasizes the household pressure, Jennifer's double life, and the fear of exposure. And those things can coexist. Human motives are rarely single-lane roads. But whatever the motive, the moral weight doesn't change. When violence is used to solve a personal crisis, it doesn't end the crisis. It multiplies it, and it spreads the damage outward into the lives of people who didn't choose any of it. That's the part one want you to sit with. Because it's easy, watching from a distance, to focus on Jennifer as the main character, either villain or victim depending on your view. But the true story is that the parents were living their own lives, with their own hopes and fears, right up until the night that took everything away. It's not just the loss of life. It's the loss of trust as a stable thing. Even for people in the broader community, cases like this plant a strange unease. If something like this can happen inside a family that looked fine from the street, what else is hidden behind other doors? Now, comment question number 3, because this is where the justice conversation gets real. Do you think the legal system should prioritize finality, the idea that verdicts should stick so families can move on, or perfect fairness, the idea that if a jury wasn't given all legally supported options, you have to do it again, no matter how painful? Which value matters more to you in a case like this? There's no easy answer. Finality matters because victims and survivors deserve an end to the process. Fairness matters because a wrongful or legally compromised verdict is its own kind of harm. And the Supreme Court's role, in part, is to protect that fairness, especially around jury decision-making. This is also why the term air of reality matters so much. In plain language, it's a test. Is there enough evidence, or enough reasonable inference from evidence, that a jury could plausibly accept a certain theory? If yes, the jury should be allowed to consider it. If no, the judge keeps it off the table to prevent speculation from driving a verdict. The fight in this case was about whether the third scenario was plausible enough to reach the jury. The Court of Appeal said yes. The Supreme Court majority agreed. A dissenting view at the Supreme Court would have restored the first-degree murder convictions, reflecting how contested and fact-specific these legal calls can be. So what does that mean for how you, as a viewer, should think about the case? It means you can hold two truths at once. 1. The evidence presented at trial was strong enough that a jury convicted. 2. The legal system still requires the jury be given the full set of verdict options that the evidence could support. And if that wasn't done, the system has to correct itself. That correction doesn't erase the grief. It doesn't erase the harm. It doesn't even erase the suspicion. It simply insists the path to a verdict matters as much as the verdict itself. Now, at this point in the story, it's natural to ask, what about Jennifer Pan's own narrative? Public reporting about the case, and footage shown in later documentaries, captures moments where Jennifer describes her life as crushing, her relationship with her parents as difficult, and her mental state as deteriorating. Those themes matter for understanding the psychological climate, but they do not transform the victims into villains. A strict parent can still be a loving parent. A pressured child can still be responsible for her choices. And in the most heartbreaking cases, both can be true at once. If you take anything from this story beyond the shock of the headline, let it be that. Now let's close the loop on the detail from the beginning, the door, because the metaphor became literal in the Crown's theory, that access to the home was not random, and that Jennifer's position in the home mattered. The Supreme Court summary includes the core fact that Jennifer was left tied to a banister, physically unharmed, while her parents were shot. That fact alone doesn't prove anything. But in the Crown's narrative, it was one of many pieces that, together, painted her as organizer rather than collateral. And whether a new jury will ultimately agree with first-degree murder again is not something anyone should pretend to know in advance. That's why the retrial exists, to let a properly instructed jury decide. Now for the final comment prompt, because this story hits people in different places, depending on what you've lived. When you hear about the pressure, the secret relationship, the lies that stacked up for years, what stands out to you as the turning point? The moment where the normal life problems crossed into something dangerous? Was it the first big lie? The first time she was caught? The escalation of control? The influence of the relationship? Tell me what you think the tipping point was. Because in a case like this, we're always trying to answer the same question in different forms. Where was the off-ramp? Where could it have gone another way? And it's painful because we know the ending. But asking the question matters, because it's how you recognize warning signs in the world outside the story. Not so you can become paranoid, so you can become attentive. If someone is trapped in a double life, the trap tightens with every day it stays secret. If someone is isolated, shame grows. If someone believes exposure will destroy them, they can begin to see impossible options as solutions. And the tragedy is, the options were never actually impossible. They just felt that way. Now, I want to end where we began, with the difference between what happened and what the law says about what happened. Bich Pan was killed in the attack at the family home. Hann Pan survived, seriously injured. Jennifer Pan and others were convicted by a jury in a case built on the Crown's theory that she arranged, through others, to have her parents killed. Years later, Ontario's Court of Appeal ordered new trials on the first-degree murder charge tied to Bich Pan's death. And in April 2025, the Supreme Court of Canada confirmed that decision. A new trial on the first-degree murder count should happen, because the jury should have been allowed to consider the third scenario, while the attempted murder convictions remain in place. That's where the public record stands. A case that feels emotionally finished, to many people is still legally unfinished in one crucial way. And for the survivors and the family members, unfinished is not just a procedural word. It's another season of pain, another return, another reminder that the past is not past. If you've made it this far, thank you for staying with a hard story in a thoughtful way. If you want more cases told with context, care, and a clear map of what we know and how we know it, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.